The year was 1913. Woodrow Wilson was president, and powerful banking interests, who had been trying for years, finally achieved their long-term goal of a silent coup d'etat by taking control of the American government. The first thing they did to accomplish their takeover was convince Secretary of State Philander Knox to lie to the American people and tell them that the 16th Amendment, the Income Tax Amendment, had been legally ratified by the states when it was not. The bankers knew that this tax would ultimately end up in their pockets. Because of this fraud, the American people were led to believe there was now a tax on their labor. Congress and the President are completely aware of this fraud, and it was even cited in a recent court case. That very same year, the bankers committed their second and by far the most diabolical fraud ever perpetrated on the American people by bribing senators to pass the Federal Reserve Act without the required constitutional amendment.
All in favor, say aye.
They did this during Christmas vacation, when many senators were home celebrating their holidays with their families. And that's how the unconstitutional Federal Reserve Act came into being. They were very clever, and they understood that whoever issued the money for America would control the government. The bankers won, and the American people lost, because most politicians will sell their soul for $1. And now the Federal Reserve could issue dollars legally. As Mayor Rothschild said, "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." He knew that he and the other bankers would now control the laws of the nation. Government gave these bankers one of its most important powers, and now had to borrow money from them and pay interest to finance the government. So the American people were forced to lower their standard of living and pay a graduated income tax to the government, just so the government could give these bankers more profits. President Woodrow Wilson, who signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, later said, in regret, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men."
The Federal Reserve was created by Congress in 1913, and it was entrusted with the power granted originally to the Congress by the U.S. Constitution to coin money and regulate the value thereof.
If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations which grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered.
If we start to act to reform our monetary system, the money changers may do what they did in 1929 and then the 1930s, crash the stock market and use that as a smokescreen while contracting the money supply. But if we're determined to fight to regain control over our money, we can come out of it fairly quickly, perhaps in only a very few months, as U.S. notes begin to circulate and replace the money withdrawn by the bankers. The longer we wait, the greater the danger we'll permanently lose control of our nation. But some still wonder why the international bankers would want to cause a depression. Wouldn't that be killing the goose that is currently laying all those golden interest eggs? Remember what Larry Bates said at the first of this videotape.
You see, in periods of economic upheaval, in economic crisis, wealth is not destroyed. It is merely transferred.
Do we have any hints as to what the money changers have in store for us? Here's what David Rockefeller, the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, the largest Wall Street bank, had to say. We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis and the nation will accept the New World Order. So, crisis is needed to fulfill their plans quickly. The only question is when the crisis will occur.
In 1984, President Ronald Reagan formed a commission to investigate where the money from the income tax was going. Peter Grace was the commission head, so this is commonly referred to as the Grace Commission. The commission found this: 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt. All individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services taxpayers expect from government. And this was in 1984. 70% of all new jobs are part-time and minimum wage. Let's see how that's working out.
Inflation is a tax. When wages are locked in and can't rise with inflation, in a free market, people suffer. Take a look at our example. This is a convenience store that opened in 1971. We wanted to compare the year 1971 with the year 2012. Snickers was the best-selling candy bar in 1971 and continued to be in 2012. The largest convenience store chain in the world was selling Snickers bars for 7 cents in 1971. Snickers bars had risen due to inflation to $1.29 by 2012. The minimum wage was $1.60 in 1971. The federal minimum wage was $7.25 in 2012. A minimum wage worker could buy 22.86 Snickers bars for an hour of work in 1971. A minimum wage worker in 2012 could buy just 5.62 Snicker bars for 1 hour of work. The minimum wage has lost 75% of its buying power from 1971 to 2012.
In 1972, Richard Nixon did this.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Taking the country off the gold standard seems like a crooked thing to do.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Let's take a look at the damage President Nixon did. We can see in our handout that gold in 1972 was pegged at $35 per ounce. And last Tuesday, gold closed at $1,396.10. In order for gold to rise to this level, inflation would have to average 9.407% from 1972 until last Tuesday. Of course, we always hear that the Consumer Price Index is much lower than this. November 1972, the Dow Jones average hit a new high of $1,003.14. Had the Dow kept up with gold, it would now be at $40,014.71. Real average return on investment is 6.787% on average from 1972 until this Tuesday. The value of money is declining at a pace of 9.407% a year, and the Dow is rising at a pace of just 6.787% a year on average from 1972. This means that the stock market is actually declining 2.62% on average per year since 1972, when priced in gold. Should the Federal Reserve be audited? President Kennedy signed Executive Order 1110 in June of 1963. It authorized the printing of debt-free notes going around the Federal Reserve, and then this happened. The United States notes were recalled shortly after President Kennedy's death.